Good afternoon. I'm Olivia Jensen. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute of Water Policy, and we have our final panel of a long day, and in many cases a long 4 days that everybody's had at Water Week. So thank you very much for staying on, and thank you very much indeed to the panelists for being here with us. We're going to talk about policies that work and building an evidence base. Now, the Institute of Water Policy is part of a public policy school, and we continually talking to the student groups about how evidence-based policy making and developing that evidence and communicating that evidence to policymakers and studying that process. Even as we do that, we're perfectly well aware that there's quite a lot of policy-based evidence making, and then there's some policy which is completely unhinged from evidence altogether. So what I'd like the panel to talk about and address today is exactly how that connect works between policy making and evidence. And all five are involved in different ways in making, translating, transmitting, and convincing policymakers and using evidence to do that. So I'm extremely pleased to welcome Professor Arjen Hoekstra from the University of Twente, Professor of Water Management, Christopher Gasson, publisher of Global Water Intelligence, Emma Porio, professor at the Ateneo de Manila University in Sociology and Anthropology, Takyoya Kamata, practice manager at the World Bank, and finally Amit Pramanik, your Chief Innovation Officer, Director, boss of the Water Research Foundation in the US. All of them, again, in different ways, are people who have wild ideas and who think in a fresh way. And that's exactly what I'm going to, I hope, give them the opportunity to do now. Arjen, can I ask you first, what's the role of academics in policy making?
Thinking about your question, what comes to my mind mostly is that both policy and sciences are very much fragmented. So what you see is we have very disciplinary scientific education, scientific research, which is advising fragmented policies. Policies that are being formulated within different parts of government, different levels, and different ministries, whatever. To some extent we are kind of trying to stimulate fragmented policy with fragmented science. So if we really want to kind of break down that system, which sometimes definitely leads to solutions, but often leads to problems. So many of the problems we have today are related to that fragmentation in both knowledge and policy. So then if the question is what can researchers do in order to promote better policies, I think that what researchers can do best is to take the systems thinking that was mentioned earlier by Mr. Tan, to think in terms of the bigger system and see how things cohere. And then what we can see if we do that, we see, for instance, that things that governments do in areas outside water actually are the things that create the water problems. So you cannot solve the water problem in the water ministry. In fact, the water problems are often created outside. Just an example, like now we are moving away from fossil fuels and we try to stimulate that. We are moving towards bioenergy. So there are a lot of policies worldwide, in the US, in Brazil, in China. Every country nearly has strong policies to promote biofuels. Well, if you look at what is the future water demand projections, then those are going to rise steeply precisely because of that policies. And biofuel policies have nothing to do with water. However, they are the biggest future water problem. So if we want to have wise water use in the future, we better talk to those people that create the energy policies of today. And so we can kind of continue in other directions as well. It's not only the energy policy, it's also trade policies. Trade policies that in fact promote unsustainable water use in places where water is highly scarce. So if we think about better trade policies, we can maybe solve our future water problems. So better trade policies, better agriculture policies, better energy policies are probably things we have to think about if we think about wise water use in the future. So that is maybe what researchers can do, see those links.
In addition to publishing, you're also heavily engaged in the Water Leaders Group, working with utilities in your events and in other forums in which you're consulted, you're dealing with policymakers. I mean, is your feeling that people lack information, that policymakers lack information, or is there another problem here?
I think that I was just thinking about this Singapore Water Week thing. How many people here have been to sessions which they have wanted, they're so boring you want to gnaw your leg off? And I think there must be a correlation between that and the ineffectiveness of policy in water. You know, particularly, I think the things which are most boring here are actually those sessions when you have those big-wig politicians up there. And you wouldn't have thought that given this is such a big, critical issue, given that there's so much work to do to make water work, that these politicians would be so completely platitudinous in the way that they talk. So what is the connection here? Well, I don't know. I divide the sort of policy challenges into three. The first challenge is what you might call essentially the parts of the world where policy can't reach. Policy is incredibly ineffective and has always been incredibly ineffective at reaching very poor people. If policy was effective at reaching poor people, we wouldn't have poor people. There is something problematic, and it's one of these circular things. The reason why they are poor is because policy doesn't reach them. And those are essentially the rural poor, who it is incredibly expensive and difficult to make impact on. Then you have what I call the sort of brownfield policy area. This is, I suppose, urban water policy, where there's actually a whole lot of strange things going on under the table, which are not really, things like the tanker mafia and, all the corruption involved in capital projects, and the fact a lot of these utilities become sort of completely driven by capital because it's impossible to get their hands on operations. And as they become driven by capital, everyone is there just to take a cut of that capital and make sure that that capital does not go into long-lasting assets, but in fact they get given another set of capital to, feed off for a bit further. And I think the third problem, which is the problem of the developed world now, and it is just becoming the problem, is essentially the end of evidence politics. Here, we are in the world of Trump and Brexit and all these other things. We're moving to this world of just gut policies, where your academics and your civil servants can do years of work, and it can just be crossed out in a moment because the politicians are working on their guts. And those, I think, are the three reasons why policy and it doesn't actually close any gaps with a sustainable development.
Works us nicely into Emma's area of expertise, which is in part looking at many areas of expertise, one of which is looking at climate change impacts and looking at how these affect, especially within Metro Manila, poor communities, exactly the sorts of people that Christopher is talking about as being cut off from policy. I mean, you've worked very actively with climate scientists on the one hand, communities on the other, and in the middle, mayors and other people who have a chance to influence this. I mean, tell us a little bit about that process and maybe areas where, give us some hope, areas where it works.
Well, if there's anything I've learned about working on climate with climate scientists is that, one, we have not appreciated that water, whether too little, as in drought, El Nino in 2015, 2016, or water too much, as in flooding in is a huge disaster, politically, economically, and culturally and otherwise. Talking about getting science into the policy making, I like what you said. Gut policy is what informs everybody. And that is very much clear now. And I remembered basically about getting the science into decision making. And I remember a few years ago, they were making road widening, and it will affect the storm drainage system in front of my university. And we told the security person in our university, told the Department of Public Highways, change the size of that culvert. That's not enough. in terms of the rainwater projections that we have? Of course it did not. So calm waters, the rainy season, flood. It took me 2 hours to get from, 1,000 meters away from university, and that did change the policy and problematic thing. So my lesson to that is that it's a disaster that will change the policy and the gut reaction. So I'd say, that's one, and the same manner that after Kitsana floods that inundated 3/4 of the city, it has changed some of the policies. After the post-Haiyan, the Haiyan disaster, which basically killed and almost 10,000 people. So water policies or climate disaster policies have changed and been reconfigured. But water code, which has been formulated since 1976, doesn't seem to be connected to the climate disaster policies. I'd say, what has research got to do with policies?
So possible two learnings from us there. I mean, one is to not waste a disaster. So academics need to have the research prepared that when the disaster happens, we can move in with really, at that stage, evidence-based policy suggestions. And then the other one is that academics maybe need to be very strategic in identifying the few politicians out there who are actually going to listen to evidence. So I'm pretty sure that the World Bank not only creates but also incorporates evidence in its policy strategies. So Tago, could I ask you, I mean, can you think of an example of when evidence has actually maybe changed your mind about policies?
Maybe it's not about us, actually. It's about the policymakers, right? So have the evidence, research papers, data, case studies, have they changed their mindset? Probably that's what we are talking about. And I have sort of like qualified yes, and in a sense that it's not a simple decision for decision makers. And you may understand the importance of cost recovery for urban. But if your government is facing a fiscal crisis and you have to borrow money from IMF or something, then you have very little space to maneuver. Okay, now I have a pressure to increase water tariff. I have a pressure to decrease the subsidy for petroleum products, and I have to increase the energy price. So, which one is the least damaging to my constituency, right? And how long I can stay in my power. So we can produce nice evidence on the water cost recovery and sustainability, so on, but it's only part of his equation. Doesn't answer to his complicated question. That's number one, I think. So the second part is that eventually it's about the users and the beneficiaries. So if the perfect is the world, if democracy works very well, I'm not sure if it's the case in many countries, including Japan, if voters make a rational decision, okay, which politician do we want to vote for in the next election, then people need to be educated enough to track the decision making, policy making, so on. So I think this is a probably important aspect. For example, in one of our client countries, in one of the capital cities, we had a government which wanted to promote enormous real estate development. And also they promised to give water connection to each single household, so some kind of like informal settlement area. This is one of the coldest countries in the world. So in winter, it was down to like 20 degrees below Celsius, or 30, 40. And those houses are not really well-built houses. It's like woods, or sometimes just tents and so on. So we did a very quick calculation. How much it cost to bring piped water into the household, insulate it, take wastewater out of it? Then in a very basic calculation, it cost $8,000 per each household. So we told the mayor, look, do you want to do that? And he didn't get any sense out of it. No, this is my promise, I have to do it. So we gave up on mayor, and we produced 2,000, 3,000 reports of cost calculation. So this is how much it costs if you want to get tap water in your house. But if you are willing to go to water kiosk, bring your water jelly, and buy, come back, this is how much it cost. Okay? And we gave them a lot of options and cost recovery. And we did like 20, 30 big city meetings with the president. So we reached out to more than 2,000 citizens actually in 2 weeks. Then we gave out all the options, cost calculation to everybody, and we took enquete survey afterwards. Did you understand what we said? And they said, yes, yes, yes. So then media picked up. So for the next 2 weeks, there's a major campaign about this promise of getting a pipe water each single household is going to bankrupt our country. Why are they promising that? So I think this element of who are our audience, I think, in the policy making, we tend to talk about the government ministers, but eventually I think the voice of beneficiaries are very important.
I mean, at the Water Research Foundation, I mean, many of the people, the clients you're working with, or the people who are commissioning research are water utilities, and then you're also interacting to some extent with regulators, with governments. And I mean, especially in the sort of technical and technology areas, one of the really tricky things probably to communicate is risk or uncertainty, and yet it's incredibly relevant to lots of what water utilities need to do, either in planning for climate change or in dealing with public health risks. Do you have any thoughts about how that can best be done, or experiences in which you've actually sort of successfully conveyed risks to policymakers in a useful way?
They are providing for the public health of their citizens, their ratepayers. The ratepayers are the ones, at the end of the day, it's the citizens who are actually paying for the cost of that service. Why is it we are complying with these limits, and why is it the cost of the water services is set at those levels? Communicating that is critical. What the public tends to sometimes hear is things from the media or things that are taken out of context, and they don't quite grasp it. They might see or hear of a study that has identified a certain chemical in the parts per billion. This will help for the public to understand that this is what they're paying for. The relative risk of that one contaminant, being exposed to that contaminant, it may take them 100 years before they'll die of that one contaminant. So I think that's where we can do a much better job here.
No, I think that's, and it might be an area in which sort of academics could work more collectively to work out how best to do this. I mean, there have been a bunch of very interesting books in the sort of behavioral economics, behavioral psychology, kind of popular literature recently, which show that actually academics have the same problem. You know, with the toxicologists, with physicians, they too fall into the same kinds of traps of overestimating risks when it's something really dreadful that's being proposed. So maybe all of us need to go through this kind of training course. Now I have one question for everybody, same question for everybody. Are there gaps? Are there things that we don't yet know, which people are not, or which researchers are not focusing enough on? I mean, for the academics, maybe this is a chance to talk about what your research agenda is for the next year. For those who are not academics, it's to give us a bit of guidance on, you know, do you feel, and I'm pretty sure this is the case sometimes, that in our offices, surrounded by stacks of paper and books, that we sometimes forget what the real issues are.
The reason sanitation became so important, it was to protect public health. They made the link between waterborne pathogens and human health. So sanitation has been recognized for more than 100 years, almost a century, to be the greatest, I guess, medical advance in prolonging human life, right? But we're past that. It gets back to flushing it away from cities and polluting elsewhere, right? And Christopher, you made a good point. It is, we're just flushing away water. Why are we producing potable water at great cost, transporting it significant distances, and then just using perhaps 1% for drinking, 10% for watering, washing, so on and so forth, and bathing, and the rest of it flushing away feces? So there has to be a different way to think this through. And I think that's where the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is trying to reinvent the toilet and the whole process over here. But in terms of making the economics work, what we need to start articulating is how are we prolonging human life? How are we providing dignity to people who have to, and education, the time that's spent trying to go and source for water, the fact that we need to provide sanitation services, it helps, I think just articulating all those additional benefits, it's quite hard to do because the situation is different from different parts of the country and the rest of the world. So I think until we get that equations right, until we look at it very holistically, until we see the connection between water and energy and food, can we make that connection? Can we draw the equation a lot better? So I think there is research needed in there, and we are beginning that. So that's a good thing. Things like climate change, the carbon calculations and all, that is actually important because that brings a focus, a lens on connecting all of these dots. That's where I believe we ought to be focusing more of our efforts.
Thank you. Everybody grabbing the mic now.
Right.
We've obviously started a controversial topic.
I think the economic calculation is one aspect, but looking at the other side of the sort of market, how much people would like to pay for certain things. So of course, it's a willingness to pay or contingent variation. It's very controversial. There's a lot of noise. Methodologically very difficult to and so on. But there are some things come out of those exercises. In many years ago, we did a very rough contingent variation sort of exercise for wastewater treatment projects and solid waste management projects, and also river cleaning up projects and so on. And it's a part of China, actually. So in one area where there's a people really appreciate the lake and the river because of religious and cultural background. The willingness to pay vis-a-vis the projects cost was enormously high, actually. So just people hate to see their lake get polluted, something like so. They're like, I'll do anything to just keep this lake clean. So like more than 23% or something like that, which you don't see in water projects. But on the other hand, if you're talking about the solid waste management component, at that time, I guess people didn't care much about those plastic bags lying around the streets. They didn't care. So actually the rate of return was like less than 5%. And we are like flabbergasted. So people really don't care about those garbage here. So it tells something about how people value your environment. That's probably subject to many things and changes at times, but something maybe you could think about, probably behavioral aspects and the economics too.
Great, that chimes with stuff we're working on, so that's excellent news. Emma, please do, on the subject of gaps in the research?
Sure. About how much water we use to flush the shit out of our system. I'm thinking that maybe that's what we need, to flush the shit in the way we live our life. For example, when I ask my students, compute your carbon and water footprints, they never think that they are connected to the making of this big footprint. And I think that is one of the shit that we have to flush out of the societal system, that we are very much consumption-driven. We think in terms of the name of development and modernization, yet we do not think what we are doing to the earth, what we are doing to our people who cannot access technology, cannot access science, cannot access education, which they were the ones paying. So anyway, let me end that comment about the shit. But I really think that, talking about, the gaps in research, in my work now, I always tell people we need translational science. There's a wide gap between science and the public that shall use this science, and the policymakers who must consume and act on this science. They don't understand risk. I always tell our people, our local government officials, you have to understand that risk refracts. The typhoon before is not the same as the typhoon now. The rainfall, how many years ago, will not return in the same way as well. So, number one, I think, is understanding the risk from the science point of view and the policymakers' point of view, and translate that to public so that they can see how they can be part of reducing risk. I'll give you an example. After Kitsana, which in 2009, which inundated 3/4 of Metro Manila, or right away they say, oh, we should not be throwing plastic now. So everybody was very good citizens. A year later, I was shopping in one of the malls, and they're using, they will not give away plastic, but you can buy if you're not carrying it back. So I told the, are you aware that that's illegal in the city? Yes, ma'am, but our boss says that we have to sell if in case you're not legal. I said, I'll report you to the, yes. But that kind of threat has not, no, I really believe citizens, citizen science must connect with formal and informal science. And then perhaps we can translate this science into actionable policies, and maybe it can be consumed by the policymakers and the program implementers. That's one. Okay. Second, I just want to say that I think the new thing that we must connect water research to all other, very important aspects, food security, sustainability, and the like. I think this has not been appreciated very well. Water is life, but it could be a disaster for everybody if we don't see the connection.
Right. Can you please really take your responsibility, have a look in your supply chain, consider what you can do? Then just another group, the investors. Investors, they just invest. Do they ever look in the sustainability of, in terms of the water, of their investments? The answer is very simple. We did research on that. Investors don't know anything about water. They don't include water in their investment decisions. So they make decisions sometimes to invest in agriculture in places where there is no water. There's just no inclusion of that awareness in investment decisions. So investors, companies, consumers can do their bit, and that bit is very large, in addition to the governments that can and should do their bit as well.
I would make the connection between water, energy, and food. Because one of the things Coca-Cola also does quite well is produce bottled water, right? But there's a cost associated with that bottle, creating that bottle. And until somebody calculates that footprint of creating that bottle, transporting that bottle of water significant distances, and then now also looking at plastic pollution. That water bottle goes somewhere. Usually ends up in the sea, plastic pollution. So a corporate entity such as Coca-Cola, once they begin to calculate all of this, and once the public begins to understand all of this, they might change their behavior slightly. It also relates to public policy on fuels, biofuels. That was a short-sighted move by almost 5-10 years ago to get fuel from corn and from other sources. When people are going hungry and they're trying to divert the corn and others, and I'm speaking from the US example, I think that was very short-sighted. So, because they didn't calculate the entire footprint over here. And the public eventually got a sense that this was wrong, and they changed the policy eventually. So there are some positive examples where public provided feedback, corporate citizens provided feedback, investors provided feedback, and changed those regulations.
I like very much the theme that's emerging here about how researchers should be talking, well, not just directly to policymakers, but absolutely to consumers, to firms, to investors. And that seems to be a big part of what we should be doing in terms of our research and our efforts to influence policy. So we're going to have to wind up very soon because people have receptions to go to and other important things. Maybe flights. Your last opportunity to bust a platitude or to call for something, whether it be Vegetarian Singapore Water Week 2020 or any other thoughts. Amit, may I return to you for a last thought?
Perspective that's missing on this panel is the regulatory perspective, perhaps. And I'm glad that you all have pulled this panel together, and I was here for the other panel discussion. And it's good to see that engagement. So I applaud the Institute for convening this, and I hope the further dialogue
goes on, bring in public citizens, bring in perhaps a regulator and a public citizen in panels such as this, because we need to be able to work together. We are an entire community living on this planet.
It's not revolutionary anything, but I think there are an element of behaviors of people who are seeking information or innovation. I think it's a selecting biases. So we are talking about the very progressive mayors and so on. They reach out to academics, professors, development partners, and so on. They would try to do anything to get the best out of it, I think. But there are probably very high-performing utility companies. They're so proud of themselves, they don't care about maybe the best practice in the world. Or even worse, the losers, probably, they're very happy with where they are. I mean, customers complain, they never get any services, politicians, get cash out of in and out, and the cash machine, so on. And then also in many cases, in some countries, like military people, barracks, government hospitals, government offices, they never pay utility bills, and that's why they go bankrupt, but they don't care. So how do we reach out to those sort of like lost audience or lost people? That's something to think about, I think. Thank you very much.
In my class, I always tell them, in every activity that you do, think, are you cooling the earth or heating the earth? And I always tell them, 10 or maybe less than years than that, I'll be 6 feet under the ground, but it's your problem. So I always tell them, I teach in one of the top elite schools, and I always tell them, this country, the top schools produce the leaders of this country, and you can see how much we have failed in educating you. Do not, I said to them always, it doesn't take talent to complain, it takes talent to provide an alternative. So I always tell them, I created a new master's degree, Master of Disaster Risk and Resilience. The tagline is problem-focused, solutions-driven. And I told my RA the other day, that's the tagline of this project. Do not be a problem. Provide an alternative solution. So anyway, with that, I was telling the other one about, I really believe, I was telling him a while ago that we need to get rid ourselves of our shitty ideas and shitty philosophies that inform our life. I really believe that we have become so enamored in our advances, so enamored in our version of what quality of life means, that we forgot that there are other considerations, like nurturing the earth that sustains our life, nurturing the environment that sustains our life, and that holds true for water. What are my closing? I want to conclude with the question that you asked me. What contributes to effective policies in water sector and the governance system? I'd say one is a proactive governance system with leaders and scientists with a moral ascendancy that connects their work, their science, to what we should be doing in terms of designing a better life, a better society, a better governance system. Also, I would like to say, I have to read it because I prepared for you. But anyway, I really believe, because I was thinking that, I think, what is the problem now? We have become disconnected to what I think we should be doing to nurture our own life and nurture the group that sustains us and nurture the earth and the universe that sustains us. I think that if we have to produce a science that is actionable, I always tell people now, the job of this project is to produce actionable science that will aid our country and nation at risk to disasters. And I think with water, I really would like that we should connect, we should be holistic, and we should connect all the research to action to policy. And I say the connectedness, the interconnectedness of our thought, our action, and our policies, and our teaching, and everything.
Well, my approach has been to essentially feel that policy is a dead loss, and that the solution is actually leadership. I mean, if you look around the world, they're also, you know, it's individual people who've really made the difference. Whether it's here in Singapore with Mr. Tan Ji-po, or you know, in Uganda with William Mahewi, or wherever it is, you know, there are these you know, striking water leaders who've really made a difference to you know, the performance of the water sector or the utilities where they've been leading. And that's why I set up the leading utilities of the world, to bring those great leaders together and try and, you know, let the world see what the best can do.
The one promise is just look again what bank you have. Where does your bank have a good policy on sustainable investments on water? If not, change your bank. That you can do tomorrow then. Yeah? Change your bank. Then if you go to the supermarket, please ask the supermarket manager. He will look at you a very strange way, but anyway, ask him or her, can you please explain me how water sustainable those products are in your supermarket? And because I would like to have more sustainable products that with a lower water footprint. So this supermarket manager will not understand. But please explain your supermarket manager that you want to have products with half the water footprint that he currently offers. Let me do something that's maybe most simple. Just tonight, don't eat meat.
You've been given your homework. Thank you so much to the panel members. The end of the day, and it's been a very fresh and lively panel, and we've all been sent home with something to do and something to think about, and I think especially us at the Institute of Water Policy. So we're very grateful to you, and thank you very much once again, and thank you to you for being here.